Um, Hi, I'm Samantha Siedlecki. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut, where I work on regional biogeochemical simulations in order to try and bring information, um, about changing ocean conditions into decision-making frameworks that coastal communities rely on. And so one of those projects that I've been working on, I'm excited to tell you about today. And so that is focused on the Washington, Oregon waters off the west coast of the United States. So this was part of a large collaboration with many groups, and so there's a couple of stories in here. And one of those, you'll see in the second half of the talk, was led by a student in my lab, Hallie Berger, who did this for her master's project, and now she's currently a Canals Fellow with NOAA's Ocean Acidification program, but she's coming back to finish her PhD with us. She's co-advised by Catherine Matassa, who's also faculty at University of Connecticut. So today I'm going to talk about regional attribution of coastal processes to saturation state pH and carbon variability in Washington, Oregon waters, a modeling study. So to start, I'm going to start with the large scale signal, which is depicted here from a figure from PMEL, the NOAA's PMEL Labs carbon program website, which shows you a long-term monitoring that's been going on from the 50s or so at Station Mauna Loa here, here depicted in this inset map on the island of Hawaii, right? And offshore, there's a nearby an ocean station called an in-water station called Station Aloha. What you see plotted on these two different y-axes is first the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere, which is plotted here in red, and that is from that Station Mauna Loa on land. And nearby, the ocean, the in-water measures at Aloha started in the early 90s or so, and you can see that in the green here, the PCO2 in the gas content of the water is largely tracking that of the air. So as carbon dioxide goes up in the air, you see it being absorbed by the ocean and increasing as well. And at the same time, pH is reduced here in this blue time series with this secondary y-axis, showing you that the pH at that same location is reduced, and this is happening in a predictable way from what we understand from the carbon chemistry. So also we can deduce from this that at large scales, the surface ocean is largely following the atmosphere, and so when PCO2 goes up, pH goes down at a similar rate, right? And we can use this knowledge, this predictability, in order to develop Earth system models and go forward, making projections about what the future holds for surface pH. And so that's what's depicted here from a special report that was released from the IPCC in 2019. What I like about this figure is that it also shows the historical observations. So you can see from here in time, we're going from historical periods into the future, and that transition between the historically modeled period and simulated and this and observed, and how that trend is captured by the simulations. And then the blue and the red lines indicate the future, and they represent a choice that we face as a society between two representative concentration pathways, 2.6 and 8.5, kind of bracketing the a lower emission scenario and a higher emission scenario, which is the choice we face as a society. And so the question of this then is this large scale information something that we can use in coastal regions in order to estimate risk? And some recent work is suggesting maybe not. And the reason is because that while that we know these big changes are happening and why they're happening, those global trends may not accurately represent what's happening inside coastal regions. And so there's some papers here for both carbon dioxide acidification as well as oxygen measures. And so what are some processes that might be responsible for this modification of these large-scale signals and what's going on? And so here's a cartoon thinking about an upwelling system, showing you some potential processes that could be responsible for this modification. And those include things like upwelling, and also rivers that are coming in coastal regions, which are carrying with their own chemical signatures. And that those rivers may also encourage or change productivity. So this water column metabolism, that's the balance between production and respiration in coastal systems. And of course the exchange with the sediments. So the fact that there are sediments so close to the surface and the shelf, and how that may be influencing the water column above it. And finally, air-sea exchange. That's happening here in the presence of freshwater plume and high and those extreme gradients. And so the focus of the work I'm going to talk about today is the west coast of the U.S., or the California current system. And so that's shown over here on the left in this cartoon from a paper by Barbara Hickey. And this figure kind of shows you that even within the California current system, that there is some spatial variability and contributions to different processes that may be responsible for that variability within the region. So in the northern portion up here, you see that it's mostly depicted as straight coast upwelling, what's called straight coast upwelling, whereas in juxtaposition to as you move further south, more filaments and jets become important. And then you also notice that there's isobaths that are depicted here. And so if you follow one north, you'll see that the shelves are wider in the north. And so there's a wider shelf, there's more straight coast upwelling. There's more canyons, which are highlighted by these red bars crossing isobaths. There's more freshwater, which is depicted by these kind of golden plumes, more influence of freshwater. And then there are retentive zones that are highlighted in green up and down the coastline, which are also interesting places to think about. And to certainly contribute to the spatial variability and carbon variables. So we know that this region in the California current is already experiencing low oxygen conditions and hypoxia regularly, and of course experiencing deoxygenation at the same time. It also experiences undersaturation events in right now in the modern, and it houses many important species that a vast ecosystem that is both culturally as well as economically important to the region. And so there have been a number of projections for the California current system that are that were downscaled projections, but to date we were not aware of one that had compared how the projections, if they were within the envelope of what the large scale models would project for the California current. So kind of asking that question, can we use the large scale information to inform us about the risk that ecosystems that are closer to the coast will experience? So we set out to kind of address that question. So our objective was to project the regionally downscaled ocean conditions in order to estimate risk to local organisms, and so thereby asking kind of, are the changes in the downscale projections different from what is projected for the California current system from those global models? And so those global models, we used 5 different CMIP5 models, and that created an ensemble for us. And downscaled first, a West Coast wide, California current wide simulation at 12 kilometer resolution, which you can read more about in Howard et al. 2020. And then we further downscaled the Northern California current system using an existing simulation in an existing model setup that's also a ROMS model at 1.5 kilometers resolution. Both of these complete with biogeochemistry. Both of these ROMS models complete with biogeochemistry. And so for the northern component. So the results, just for one of the carbon variables, are shown here. So you see a map of saturation state for aragonite. This far left panel shows you the change in the surface between the modern and the future 2100 conditions under RCP 8.5, so that more severe representative concentration pathway. And then inset is the map for the higher resolution downscaled simulation for the northern component of the California current system, the northern region. The middle panel shows you the change from the future minus the present, showing you the integrated over, averaged over the upper 200 meters, excuse me. And then the bottom conditions here are shown on the far right. So the change in 3 different regions of the water column surface over the entire 200 meters, and then water column, and then on the far right showing you the bottom conditions. What we found was that the downscale projected change were consistent with the global model in the sense that the direction for all of the trends for the RCP 8.5. So we found that the conditions were warmer, more acidic, higher carbon content, and lower in oxygen, consistent with the large scale projections from CMIP 5. The carbon variables, however, were the only variables that were all modified. And what I mean by that is that they were different from what the CMIP 5 changes, or what the projected changes were for the California current system. They fell outside the range provided by the ensemble. And the magnitude of that modification and that change differed depending on the region of the water column, so the surface kind of 200 meter average or bottom, as well as spatially within the CCS, so the north versus the rest of the CCS. The Northern California current system, the modification in that region is the most pronounced in all regions of the water column for the carbon variables. So again, variables like temperature, oxygen, and others were not modified. It was just the carbon variables that were. And so let's walk through what that means. So here's an example showing you for the California current wide, the 12 kilometer simulation. You can, for the depth at 200 meter averaged, we'll focus on just one of these for now. So the California current wide, the 1 degree simulation, or that CMIP 5 simulation, would project for the California current wide that we would experience by 2100 under RCP 8.5, a decline of 0.71, which falls within the ensemble range of the downscaled simulations, and so this was not seen to be. When we compare those two, you don't see any modification. However, we move to the northern region, which is the Cascadia region here, and we compare what again, this column is what the 1 degree or the CMIP 5 simulations would project, and to the ensemble of the Cascadia downscaled simulations, we see that it is outside of the range, and so in this case, the carbon variable experience modification by the downscaled variables the downscaled simulations and projected conditions are different than what the CMIP 5 model projects, and in this case, it's less severe. And so that 0.62 falls outside the range of the ensemble and is in fact more severe than the downscaled projections would project. So that means that modification actually is dampening that global change. Right? So what is responsible for that modification? So one idea is that upwelling may have changed, and of course this is one that's been discussed in the literature quite a bit. So Evan Howard, as part of his paper examining the 12 kilometer simulation changes, looked at the winds, as did we in the paper that I led recently for the California current. And while there was a small increase in the intensity of the winds, in-water measures of upwelling, which include a plot here that Evan showed of the vertical velocities at 50 meters, as well as some computed metrics called QD and Beauty, which we also computed, did not show much change. So let's dig into that in this figure. And so what I'm showing here is first a map of the showing you the northern, central, and southern regions, and this is just the historical average of the velocities at 50 meters. And then on the right, what you have is a time series, so showing you the seasonal evolution in the northern, central, and southern of both the historical hindcast of that 12-kilometer ROMS in black, as well as the envelope of the downscaled Earth system model-driven projections in red. And so if the black line falls within the envelope of the red, then you don't see very much change. And so there are some places where you would see in time that you would see a bit of modification, but overall there is not there's not much alteration in the upwelling, despite the increase in the intensity of the winds. And so further analysis in Howard, which you can go check out, indicates that there was increased stratification, which altered the upwelling, thus compensating for the minor increase in the wind intensity. And there's also no change in the seasonality of the winds, the way in the results that we analyzed. So then what's driving that amplification or the modification in the carbon variables, not in oxygen? It turns out that the future changes in the carbon variables are all correlated to nutrient cycling and total alkalinity variability resolved by the downscale projection. So that's likely related to benthic pelagic coupling that's present by a better resolved shelf in these higher resolution simulations, or the sediment interactions that are also happening closer to the surface and influence the water column more in the region. So it's basically the presence of a better resolved presence of the shelf in the downscale simulations that seems to be contributing to that modification. So now we take this information with us into a project funded by the Ocean Acidification Program, which you may have heard about on Monday, which led by Jan Newton and Melissa Poe, looking at it to do a regional vulnerability assessment in terms of ocean acidification for the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary region. And so this was a collaboration that includes is a very transdisciplinary team and including managers as well. And so this is really social science and natural science integrated into this regional vulnerability assessment approach. And so what we did is we focused on a place-based sociological system approach. So we, kind of these different colors indicate different aspects. So these orange colors are where the projections come in, and sort of thinking about the natural science questions and kind of estimating risk to the ecosystem. And then there's some social science aspects and some integrated questions. But all of these require it's a loop, because this is a very iterative process where we were going back and forth with the regional stakeholders and managers and communities really present in the conversation throughout the entire process, getting their feedback and thinking about what their concerns and as well as their curiosity, were in terms of designing and thinking about the results of the science. So with that, I'll show you some of how we brought this information directly in. And so the tribal communities that reside on the outer coast of Washington, many of them were involved in the project or continue to be involved in the project. And so here's a map kind of looking back at looking bird's eye view, but kind of back at the coastline of the Washington Shelf here. And the red region outlines kind of where that Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary resides. And each of those triangles then shows you where a bottom mountain mooring at 42 meters has been for quite some time within the sanctuary. And those were analyzed by Simona Len, and they measure temperature, salinity, and oxygen, and she has an empirical relationship to estimate carbonate system variables, which was used on those mooring records. And so these are records that the coastal tribes really rely on in order to think about their kind of usual and accustomed fishing areas that are located nearby. The moorings are, an important source of information there. And so, of course, bringing this information in has all sorts of environmental justice and changing ocean condition implications, as the tribes are a community that cannot move to adapt to changing conditions without giving up their way of life. So, in sort of establishing what's going on with the ocean conditions there, Simone made a series of plots to look at and synthesize what we know about in the modern. And so here, the way these plots work is that the Macaw Bay, which is the furthest north one, is on the left-hand column on the top, and then as you move south to Tewit Head, and then Kalaloch is further south than that, and Cape Elizabeth is the furthest south. So you kind of follow this squiggle on the upper right-hand corner as a guide. So we see experience in the modern. This is now over many years, 2006 to 2017, increasing percent of the upwelling season, as it is seasonal upwelling in the north. So these plots are mostly between April and October. You see that the oxygen concentration declines seasonally, and that you get more low oxygen hypoxic conditions over a longer period of the year the further south in the sanctuary you go. So Cape Elizabeth experienced 44% of the summer in the modern as hypoxic conditions. And she can also do this then for undersaturation of saturation state. And so this indicates that even more of the upwelling season experiences undersaturation, and there is not as clear of a north-south trend, although the most severe conditions do exist in the south, with more spatial variability there. And so we can compare that to how our historical simulations do as a baseline, as a way of establishing trust with the communities. And so we did that here for our baseline conditions, just comparing at those different mooring sites the percentage of the upwelling season that the model simulates experiences hypoxia. And this is just one form of evaluation. We have done many more, but just to show you that we do spend time thinking about how well the model does before projecting into the future. And so here we go with looking at the projections then. And so if we look at annual timescales now, not just during the upwelling season, we see that when we compare the present in the blue to the red is the future, that we see an increase at all mooring locations in the amount of time that hypoxia is present. And if we limit that to just during the upwelling season, which is when hypoxia happens, you see that it's even more severe of an increase. And of course skewed toward the southern range of the sanctuary. We can also look at that for undersaturation, and we see that comparison with the observations on the left, and then on the right the future projections for the region. And these are annual now, not just during the upwelling season, because winter the downwelling season in the winter still happens, and so that relieves the stress of hypoxia, but does not relieve the stress of undersaturation. And so the organisms can be exposed to undersaturation 75% of the year in the future, as opposed to closer to like 30 to 40% in the modern. So this has implications for the entire ecosystem, which is experiencing multiple stressors, going on, and so warming, hypoxia, acidification, all are things that are happening at the same time. And one of the organisms that is both culturally and economically important in the region is the Dungeness crab. And so Dungeness crab experience a complex life cycle, and so it was one that's kind of depicted here. I'll talk about that more in a second, but this was an organism that we decided that we wanted to focus on for our estimation of risk, as it was identified by the tribal communities as one that they were very interested in, both culturally and economically. And so Hallie Berger, who's pictured here, is a graduate student co-advised with Catherine, led a vulnerability assessment with life stage considerations on Dungeness crab using the projections that I just walked through. And because crab experience a complex life cycle, they have a pelagic and a benthic life stage, and those stages experience different spatial and temporal distributions, their exposure to all of these multiple stressors will vary. And so here we are defining vulnerability as the degree to which the system is susceptible to, unable to cope with adverse effects. And she really mirrored her, and that's like the IPCC definition, right, of what vulnerability is. And so that's what we went with. And we really expanded on this in order to expanded on a method to do this vulnerability assessment that was established by Emma Hodgson et al., who's also a co-author on the work, and it allows us to account for the differences in the stressors consequence. So temperature versus oxygen versus pH versus, may have different consequence scores in our vulnerability assessment, but also have experience different exposures across different life stages. Emma really focused on Oregon and California and worked on 6 different species, including Dungeness crab. And in this case, we just focused on Washington and Oregon and only focused on crab, but multiple stressors, not solely OA variables. And so what I'm showing you here is how we used a transport model to help estimate exposure. So Hallie ran a lot of particle simulations that with behavior in the larvae to understand how that early life stage would be exposed to low pH conditions, and indeed you can see them vertically migrating up and down in the water column. I'll play that again. You can see that the red ones are experiencing pH conditions that's considered the danger zone, or regions where that lab experiments have identified potential stress to this life stage, which is the megalopi and zooia, that earlier life stage, and within the sanctuary. And so that we found that that this life stage will be exposed to more low pH conditions more often in the future. So she also estimated, of course, exposure for the other life stages that are more confined in the water column, not pelagic, the benthic stages, and so that included the eggs as well as the juvenile and adults that have settled in. And so what we're looking at here is the difference in the seasonality. So of course, the bottom-dwelling stages will be exposed to low pH more often in the future as well. On the left-hand side, you can see that in the downwelling season as well as in the upwelling season. And then there's a table on the right that kind of summarizes in the present and the future, and you can see how both those life stages, both the eggs, which are attached to the adult females during the downwelling season, as well as the juveniles and adults, which are concentrated year-round between 30 and 90 meters depth, how their exposure increases. And so we take that all together, vulnerability scores across all 3 stressors increase. And so vulnerability here is this consequence times exposure, and while and so this is population level vulnerability. So it's weighted, each one of those exposures, each exposure was calculated in consequence for each one of these life stages, and this life stage weight, the population matrix from Emma Hodgson's, was used in order to scale it up to a population level vulnerability. And this was estimated for each of these environmental stressors. And so what we get from this is that changes in oxygen generate the highest vulnerability. You can see that population level vulnerability, but that the pH change is the most different from today. So the present here is in blue, and the orange shows the future. The seasonal, these are annual, like over the entire year. But if we wanted to think about the seasonal maximum exposure rather than annual averages because of the seasonality of the system, then you could estimate the population level vulnerability with these stars, and so see that how much more important that seasonality is for oxygen, because it experiences the hypoxia only during the upwelling season. we're also able to not only identify which life stage and which variables are which stressors are important for managers to consider and for tribal communities, but also to identify the locations for multi-stressor hotspots to emerge. So kind of locations where all three of these stressors kind of overlap. For the different habitats, so one is for the juvenile and adult habitat at the bottom, and another would be for the larval habitat as well. And so this is like a cartoon just showing you that as these migrate vertically in the water column at higher temperatures at the surface, they may experience low pH at 70 meters, and so their habitat is experiencing both of these things. So their exposure includes both. So as moving forward then, because oxygen is so important for managers to consider in terms of maintaining this fishery, one thing that has come to increasing attention recently is that this video from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife from 2017, just showing the crab pot that was left out for a few weeks, which is pretty typical in the area during low oxygen conditions that ended up becoming hypoxic, and most of the crabs ended up dying in the trap, which doesn't do anybody any good. It's because there's no way to prevent the females who are not fished in order to try and sustain the fishery from being included, or juveniles for that matter, from being included in the trap. So this points to an action that managers can look to in order to try and help sustain the fishery. And so they are thinking about oxygen conditions within the summer, which is in the tail end of the fishing season. And so we have a series of forecasts in the area that have been co-developed in order to aid managers with managing low oxygen conditions during those seasonal evolution of hypoxia. And it includes observations that are real-time reported through a regional IOS portal, which is called NANUS in the area. And so they can see at those moorings that they monitor the low oxygen conditions developing. And then we also provide a series of forecasts, one that is shorter term called LiveOcean, which is just 36 hours, and then a seasonal one, which is called JScope, which provides a little bit longer outlook. And so that seasonal forecast system called JScope, we regularly meet quarterly with the state and tribal shellfish managers and have co-designed products that are now included in the Pacific Fishery Management Council annual materials. And you can check out more about us on this website, hosted on the NANUS website. But we're working with, we have forecasts for sardine, hake, juvenile crab, and adult crab soon to be populated there. The forecast model was used by the Cornwall Indian Nation to take management action based on the observations, like these OOI observations showing the extreme low oxygen conditions in 2018 in the region. And so they closed early due to the reoccurring hypoxic conditions over the summer there in order to try and help sustain the fishery. So with that, I'll conclude. We use these downscale projections in ocean conditions for the California current. They are consistent with the global model directional trends for scenario RCP 8.5 in that they are warmer, more acidic, higher carbon content, and lower in oxygen. But they were modified with respect to the magnitude of the change for all of the carbon variables. And the regional model projections for the Northern California current indicate that the percent of the year experiencing hypoxia and ocean acidification conditions will nearly double under the future climate change scenarios, RCP 8.5. We used a population level vulnerability approach from Hodgson et al. 2016, further refined by Halley to estimate the population level vulnerability of Dungeness crab to these changing stressors, and found that it does require consideration of life stage specific impacts as they inhabit different regions of the water column at different times, which experience very different exposures. And our results identify that adult life stage is critical to population growth, and that the mitigation for this life stage under hypoxic conditions is critical to manage for the fishery. So taking action during those Those low oxygen events during the summer is really important to the long-term vulnerability of the fishery. So through these iterative collaborative conversations with regional managers and stakeholders, both state and tribal, there's proactive adaptive strategies informed by robust science can be established, prioritized, and implemented in order to aid management in sustaining these marine resources long term. With that, I'd just like to thank my funding sources and you all for your attention, and happy to take questions.